Now, I recently heard of a fellow who is just kind of driving down the road, minding his own business, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, another car came and bashed into him, and the car accident was terrible. His car is totally maimed and mangled, and he kind of, it took him a little bit, but he realized that he could climb out through the window, that he wasn't actually hurt. So he climbs out of his car. It's a big mess. And just as he's getting out, he sees the lady climbing out of a car that's also pretty mangled up. And she seems fine too. And she all of a sudden says to him, maybe this is a sign from God. Look at our cars. They're both really destroyed, but we're okay. Maybe God intended for us to meet. And maybe God intends for us to become good friends. Who knows where this might go? The guy's thinking this is pretty weird, right? But he also recognizes that she's pretty hot. And so he comes to the conclusion, oh yes, of course, this must be a sign from God. And so then she walks over to the trunk of her car, which is popped open and through the accident, and it reaches in and pulls out this bottle of wine. And she says, another sign from God. Look at our cars, are both totally destroyed. Here's this bottle of wine. A sign from God that we're supposed to celebrate together. Now, he quickly agrees to that one. So she opens the wine, gives it to him. He takes a big swig, and she says, you look pretty shook up over this accident. Maybe you should have another drink. So he has another drink, hands her the bottle. She puts the lid back on. And he says, aren't you going to take a drink? She says, no, just waiting for the cops to show up. The ways this sermon is about games we play in trying to manage and control people in our lives. And it's based on Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 to 12. And as we work our way through this, I want you to think, if you're a parent, I want you to think about how you respond to your kids and try to get them to do what they might not want to do, but you want them to do. Or maybe your spouse, how you get your spouse to do the things that you want your spouse to do. This applies to any relationships we have, but I want you to think particularly about those who are closest to you and the games that you play to get them to do the things that you want them to do. I've come to understand Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 to 12 to be about the deadly ways in which we try to manage and control other people. We do it in two ways. One is by blaming or condemning them, or secondly, by forcing our wonderful, godly ideas upon them, solutions to their problems, but solutions they might not be ready for. Instead of using these two methods, Jesus simply shows us a better way, the way of simply asking, of requesting, a way that actually draws them into God's kingdom rather than into the web of our devices and plans. So let's begin by reading Matthew chapter 7, 1 to 12. Remember, this is about how we try to manage and control people. Do not condemn. Do not force your wonderful things upon them. Just ask. Ask them and ask God. So I'm going to ask Chris to come and read for us Matthew 7, verses 1 to 12.
Matthew 7, 1 to 12. Do not condemn or blame. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Do not force your wonderful things upon them. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Just ask for what you want. Ask them and ask God. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives. The one who seeks finds. And to the one who knocks, the door will be opened. Which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? So, in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets.
Now, for me, the key to understanding what this passage is about is verse 12. Verse 12 has forced me to rethink what I've always thought and been taught about this passage. Look again at verse 12. It starts with the word so, or literally, and some translations follow the literal, says therefore. In other words, connects back to everything he said just before it. Because of what I've just said, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. Now, I've always read verses 7 to 11 to be talking only about prayer. I've thought that the ask, seek, knock section is about prayer, only about prayer. But if that is true, then verse 12 doesn't make sense. Verse 7 and 8 are first and foremost about how we relate to other people, to the ones that we've been trying to control and manage. Ask, seek, knock is how we are to approach others. Then, if that's the case, then verse 12 makes sense. If verse 7 and 8 are only about prayer, then verse 12 is out of place. Verse 7 and 12 say that this is Jesus' words on how we relate to others. Listen to verse 7, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives. He who seeks finds. And to him who knocks, the door will be open. So the point of this passage, Jesus wants us to give up trying to control and manage other people and rather learn to simply ask them and ask him. By giving up control, by asking, we are giving up control. By trying to not manage anymore, instead of us demanding, we give up control and we simply ask. First we ask them, then we ask God. So let's look closer at these verses. It says, first of all, do not condemn, verses 1 to 5. Jesus starts off by saying, do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it'll be measured to you. These same words appear in Luke chapter 6, and in verse 37 he adds, Jesus expands on what he says in Luke. And in Luke he adds, do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Now, I often hear this verse quoted by people who, what they'll say is, don't judge me. Jesus says not to judge. If I have a negative, or if anybody has a negative opinion about what they're doing, they say, well, don't judge me. You're not supposed to judge me. But I want us to be clear here. Jesus is not telling us to give up the valid practice of discerning right and wrong, discerning what's going on. Parents would be foolish to do that in raising their children. We are, however, to give up the practice of condemning. We are to hold people responsible and discuss their failures with them and even assign them penalties without attacking their worth as human beings and belittling them. So Jesus' concern is that we give up the deeply rooted practice of condemning and blaming. We must be particularly conscious of the lie that says it's okay to condemn as long as we're condemning about the right thing. No. Jesus says stop condemning altogether. Let's stop for a moment and ask, why do we condemn? Why are we so committed to blaming people? Why are condemnation and blame so deeply rooted, or such deeply rooted practices in our lives? And the answer is because we very early on in life learn the tremendous power we believe that condemnation has to get other people to do what we want them to do. We learn to have great confidence in the power of condemnation to straighten out the other person. But as Jesus points out, condemnation doesn't work. It doesn't normally achieve the change, the results that we want. Rather, it backfires, it comes back upon us. Very rarely is a person who's condemned actually makes the change that we want. You see, Jesus says condemnation results in counterattack. The way you judge others will determine the way that you are being judged. So parents who condemn their children for drug use shouldn't be surprised to see their kids come back at them with regard to their use of alcohol or caffeine coffee and tobacco. Don't condemn or you will be condemned. This principle of people treating us like we treat them explains why condemnation as a strategy in correcting other people very rarely works. Almost always fails. If you were here earlier in this series, you will remember we talked about Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 5. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to people long ago, 'Do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you that anyone who is angry," and there that word angry means anger that broods, that just refuses to forgive. So anyone who is angry so that he refuses to forgive with his brother will be subject to judgment. And anyone who says to his brother, "Raka," remember, raka is a word that comes from the sound you make when you're preparing to spit. That word has to do with contempt. So we're moving from anger that refuses to forgive to contempt. Anybody who says raka is answerable to the Sanhedrin, and anyone who says "you fool," and there the fool is not referring to their mental ability, but to their moral character. And so the progression is anger that refuses to forgive to contempt, to trying to destroy the person's reputation. Now, these verses we're studying today tie in or build upon what we talked about then. There is a connection between anger and contempt and condemnation. Let's think for a moment about how powerful condemnation is. Condemnation cuts into the very core of who we are. That's why it hurts so badly. And at the same time, why we rely upon it so heavily. Jesus calls us to step aside from using condemnation and also from receiving it, for that matter. You see, if you choose to condemn me, I can choose to believe what God says about me, and I don't need to receive that condemnation. And that's true of all of us. We don't need to condemn, and we don't need to receive condemnation. But to come to that place requires that we grow significantly spiritually. Christ judges, but he doesn't condemn. And he wouldn't receive condemnation either. Now back to the connection between anger and condemnation. Anger often leads us to condemn others, partly because it's such a handy way to hurt people deeply. And anger desires to hurt. If we've learned to give up anger, the kind of anger that refuses to forgive, and to give up contempt, we will very rarely condemn. Jesus continues, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First you must take the plank out of your own eye, then you can see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Now these verses raise a number of questions. Like, for example, how does Jesus know that there's a plank in your eye? That you have a serious character flaw that needs to be addressed before you deal with your brother? How does he know that? Secondly, how does he know that when we talk to our brother that we're actually hypocrites? Now, I've often thought the answer to this question has to do with the fact that all of us sin. We've all got sin in our lives. And I need to be conscious of my sin before I talk to you, because, in fact, I might actually have a worse one than you do. And so what am I doing talking to you? There's more going on in this passage than that. I believe what Jesus is talking about, his main point is this. He is saying that condemnation itself is the plank in our eye. He knows that the mere fact that we are condemning someone shows that our hearts do not have the kingdom rightness that he is talking about. Condemnation, with its usual companions of anger and contempt and self-righteousness, blind us to the truth about the other person. We cannot see clearly to help him as long as we are condemning him. We will never know how truly to help him until we've grown to the point where we no longer condemn, period. Getting the plank out of our eye doesn't mean, it's not a matter of somehow changing ourselves so that we can condemn people in the right way. It's rather that we get to the point where we never condemn people, period. It's learning not to condemn. So after learning not to condemn, not to blame, Jesus secondly says, do not force your wonderful things upon others. And parents with kids who aren't cooperating, here's a favorite thing for parents to do. Got my wonderful idea that I'm going to force on you. The next verse, verse 6, is about how we try to manage others by pushing the things of God upon them, whether they want them or whether they're ready for them or not. It says, "Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces." Now, to be honest with you, for a long time, I didn't know what to do with this verse. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know how it connected to the verses before it and afterwards. But I believe it's about how it has to do with how we try to control people and manage them, not this time with condemnation, but rather by forcing our wonderful, often very godly ideas, often very good things, upon the other person. The way these verses are often interpreted fly in the face of what we just saw Jesus say in verses 1 to 5. You've probably heard that the pearls, the good things, are the gospel. And there are certain people out there that are like dogs and pigs, that they'll never receive the gospel. So don't share it with them, because then it's like throwing pearls before the pigs. But in light of what Jesus just said about condemnation and blaming, that it seems very unlikely that that's what he means here. Let's be clear. Jesus is not suggesting that certain people are to be viewed as pigs or dogs. He is not saying that we shouldn't give them the gospel. We shouldn't give them good things. Rather, we are to be like God. And in the parallel passage in Luke chapter 6, it says, God is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. And so not casting your pearls before swine can't be about us not sharing the gospel with people. The problem with the pearls and the pigs isn't that the pigs are unworthy, is rather the usefulness of the pearls to the pigs. Now, if you worked with pigs, and my first job, by the way, was working on a pig farm. If you work with pigs, you'll know the answer to this question. What do pigs want to do with just about everything you give them? What do pigs want to do with everything you give them? They want to eat it, right? And so if you're in charge of feeding the pigs, and all you give them is pearls, what are the pigs going to do? They're going to, according to the verse, they're going to turn on you and tear you to pieces. You know why? Because at least you're edible. The pearls are of no use to them, and they're hungry, but they can eat you. This is a picture of our efforts to correct and control others by pouring our good things on them. Often truly precious things, but things that they cannot use because they're not ready for it. Dallas Willard puts it this way: forcing religion on young people, even though it makes no sense to them, is a major reason they graduate from church about the same time they graduate from high school and do not return for 20 years, if ever. We need to be aware that often our pearls are offered with a certain sense of superiority that keeps us from paying attention to those that we're trying to help. You know, after all, our solutions are really good solutions, aren't they? And this is really good stuff. And we're offering it to them, and they just don't see it, but, oh, it's such good. If they would just do this, it would be such a good idea. And very easily, very quickly, some contempt, some impatience, some anger, some condemnation can slip in. Jesus says, be careful not to force your wonderful things upon others. And thirdly, then, that brings us to what we are to do. Just ask. Ask for what you want from them and from God. Verse 7, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, to the one who knocks the door will be opened. When we move from demanding to trying to manipulate people to simply asking them, we give up control. Because they can refuse our request. They know, I don't want to do that. But let's not underestimate the power of the request. Now, I remember a study I saw a few years ago of how people responded when a total stranger would walk up to them, pretend to be lost, and ask for directions. And it was amazing how much effort people would go to. They'd bring out little pieces of paper and start drawing maps. They would walk down to the corner and they would point and they would explain. They would go to great efforts to help lost people just because they had been asked. Don't underestimate the power of asking. In fact, the power of asking is so powerful that it makes some people uncomfortable. For a number of years, Sharon and I, in January, we would go door to door, collect for the Alzheimer's Society. We did this in Morden. Same block, same people, same year after year. This year, I did door to door in our neighborhood. Now, the power of asking is so powerful that at times people will pretend not to be home when you ring the doorbell just so they don't have to say no to you. Now, I don't care if they give anything or not, but some people just don't want to say no. If you don't believe me, just look at someone eating a sandwich in front of the family dog. The dog doesn't have to say anything, just looks at him. In our close relationships, a request is often enough to bring the desired result, unless, of course, those relationships have already been damaged by previous experiences. So Jesus says, give up trying to control and manage people through condemnation and pouring your wonderful things upon them. Just simply ask. You see, as long as I am condemning and pushing my wonderful pearls on you, I'm your problem. You have to respond to me. And usually that leads to judging me back, or as Jesus says, biting me. But once I've given up control, I'm no longer trying to control the situation, I'm no longer trying to manage, I'm no longer your problem. And as I listen, I can quickly become an ally. We need to see the healing power of a request in our relationships. If we switch from trying to control people with condemnation or pushing our good things upon them to simply asking, many of us, our relationships can be healed. Now, I believe that Jesus is also saying you can't treat people one way and treat God a different way. Now, don't be too quick to reject this. Think this through. But let me use an illustration. Say I'm trying to manage and control you, and you're just being an idiot, and you won't do what I want you to do. Right? Now, what's the next step? As Christians, what's our next step? Normally, if we're holy. One step is a cuss at you, but that's not the good one, right? The next step is to pray. Now, think about this. If I am demanding and controlling in my relationship with you, when I begin to pray to God about you in that situation, my guess is that in my prayer, there is a hint of that demand and that control. We don't treat God differently than we treat other people. And so we need to be careful. We need to watch what we're doing. Jesus says, be watchful about our hearts. Indeed, even praying can be a way to try to control and manipulate people. He's saying just simply ask. So this naturally brings us to prayer. Verse 9. Which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone, or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? Now you might say to me, Russ, I've been thinking this through. I've been thinking about my relationship with, someone close in my life. And I can see how I've used blame and condemnation. And I've, tried to force my wonderful things upon them. And I can see how I've done all of that. I've tried to manage them. I've tried to control them. And there's been a lot of water under the bridge, and if I now go and ask them, they're not going to respond well because of our history. What do I do? And the answer is, we ask God, we pray. Give up trying to control and pray. Our confidence in God is the only thing that makes it possible for us to treat others as they should be treated. Turn this over to God and ask God, I've messed this up, but I'm asking you to do a powerful thing here. This leads to the therefore of verse 12. Therefore, or so, in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets. You don't want other people to blame you, to condemn you. You don't want other people to force their good things upon you. You want them to listen, to simply request. In conclusion, instead of harassing those near us with judgments and our treasures, let's stand before them with our helpless request. I'm just asking you. And at the same time, standing before God, our mighty King, with our requests for them. Let's pray. Father, I pray with regard to our relationships. And Father, sometimes we want so badly for the people that we love to act in a certain way, to take certain steps. We try to push them, or we try to draw them with good things. I ask you to forgive us for the ways we try to manipulate and control people. Increase our faith in our understanding and our trust of you, that we can give up control. We can simply ask, and we can ask you to work in a powerful way. I pray this in the name of Christ. Amen.